Step into the world of mythic tales, where age-old sagas, buried terrors, and otherworldly battles are brought to life. If you're fascinated by the hidden corners of mythology, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another epic tale. Music. On June 28, 1491, Henry Tudor was born as the second son of Henry VII. Few could have foreseen that this infant would one day rise to become one of England's most revolutionary and fearsome rulers. By the time he claimed the throne in 1509 at age 17, he was the epitome of Renaissance perfection: tall, vigorous, proficient in Latin and French, a talented musician, a devout Catholic, and strikingly handsome. Venetian diplomat Pasqualigo once remarked, "His Majesty is the most striking ruler I've ever beheld." He relishes hunting, exhausting 8 or 10 horses in a single chase. Yet, this radiant image would fade. The vibrant, golden-haired youth who once galloped through England's woodlands would, by life's end, become unrecognizable in both body and spirit. The pivotal moment arrived on a chilly January day in 1536 during a jousting event at Greenwich Palace. At 44, Henry, still chasing youthful glory, mounted his steed for the display. Disaster struck when his horse collapsed mid-charge, pinning the king beneath it. Unconscious for 2 hours, he survived, but something within him was irrevocably broken. A chronic wound on his leg, never to heal, began to consume him. This wasn't merely a physical wound, it signaled the gradual unraveling of a king. The ulcer oozed with pus, releasing a stench so vile that courtiers could detect his presence before he appeared. To flinch was treason, to retch, a death warrant. Historian Susanna Lipscomb observed, "The odor was repulsive, like decaying flesh in the truest sense." Lipscomb, 1536, the year that changed Henry VIII, 2009. The decay wasn't confined to his body. A darker force emerged within Henry that day. In 1536, he sentenced Anne Boleyn, his second wife, to death on flimsy charges. Whether due to head trauma or the stark awareness of his mortality, the king spiraled into suspicion, brutality, and an insatiable need for dominance. As Henry's mobility waned, so did his restraint. Once fit and muscular, he grew immensely corpulent. His waist expanded from 32 inches to over 54, his weight exceeding 320 pounds. Unable to walk unaided, palaces were altered, doorways widened, hoists installed. He was lifted from bed to chair by a bespoke pulley system, a monarch reduced to freight. Eustace Shopweis wrote, "The king has become so massive that his steps shake the floor beneath him." Calendar of State Papers, Spain, Volume 7, 1536. His transformation into a human fortress was driven by his voracious appetite. Records show he consumed over 5,000 calories daily, roasted swan, venison tarts, barrels of wine and ale. Vegetables were beneath him. This diet, coupled with complete inactivity, hastened his decline. The ulcer deteriorated. Bloodletting, mercury salves, and burning irons proved futile. Flesh eroded to bone, infection spread up his legs. Physicians choked in private. The King of England was rotting alive. Yet Henry's pride endured. At 49, he wed Catherine Howard, aged 17, calling it his renewed youth, a bitter twist of fate. Her disgust was thinly veiled. When her infidelity came to light, Henry's retribution was swift: execution. Heads rolled, as did any pretense of the king's remaining humanity. Each stage of Henry's decline cracked the illusion of divine kingship. No longer revered, he was dreaded for his horror. Courtiers whispered, Whitehall's walls echoed his cries. The prince who once captivated Europe became a grotesque figure, draped in silks to mask the scent of decay. Historian Alison Weir noted he morphed into a swollen, paranoid, foul-odored despot, feared by all, loved by none. The king is transformed. Whether it's the fall from his horse or the burden of his sins, he's no longer the man I knew. A shadow festers within him, visible, rancid, and undeniable. As years passed, Henry's body crumbled with torturous slowness. His once vibrant energy faded beneath layers of infection, flesh, and agony. The ulcer on his right leg, notorious among courtiers, worsened relentlessly. What began as broken skin became a gaping, necrotic void. Physicians approached with trembling hands, holding scented cloths to their faces. Treatments, cauterization with searing irons, arsenic and mercury poultices, only amplified his suffering and decay. One report noted the exposed bone gleaming through rotting tissue, a grim testament to the king's daily disintegration. The stench became as iconic as his crown, permeating palace halls and heralding his approach with dread. His movements required a team of servants to shift him between rooms. Stairs were impossible, horses unmountable, thrones inaccessible without mechanical aid. Engineers crafted a hoist to move his massive frame between chairs and beds. Doorways were expanded out of necessity, not splendor. Yet Henry insisted on full court protocol. Courtiers knelt and bowed before a king immobilized, sweating, and groaning from open wounds. Disobedience was unthinkable. Historian David Starkey wrote, "It wasn't just that the king suffered. His suffering had to be concealed." Appearances, even amid the reek of decay, mattered more than reality. Though his leg oozed endlessly, the true infection had seized his mind. Chronic pain and confinement warped his character into a weapon. His notorious temper grew erratic, fueled by distrust and stoked by courtiers eager to shift blame. His paranoia flourished like mold in a tomb, unchecked and consuming. Whispers in the court became screams in the tower. A look, a word, or even silence could be deemed treason. Loyal subjects faced the scaffold without evidence or trial. The king, once a theological scholar, now executed advisors for imagined slights. Fear was the court's only fluent tongue. His fifth marriage, to young Catherine Howard, ended in cruel irony. The teenage queen, overwhelmed by her husband's smell, decay, and fury, sought comfort in another man's arms. Henry's reaction was not just wrath, it was a kind of heartbroken vengeance, as if her betrayal confirmed the deformity he now saw in his own reflection. Both Catherine and her alleged lover were executed, their blood adding to the mountain of corpses that marked the trail of the once ideal prince. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper," Catherine was reported to have said before her beheading, words that cut deeper than any blade. The humiliation of being unloved, even by a girl plucked from obscurity to be his queen, stung the king's pride more than the festering ulcers ever could. By the time of his final marriage to Catherine Parr, Henry no longer sought love or beauty but management. Catherine served as nurse more than wife, tending to his physical needs with a composure that astonished even his enemies. She dressed his wounds, supervised his meals, and handled his fits of fury like a seasoned caretaker tending to a dying lion. Their union, unlike the others, did not end in betrayal or blood but in resignation. There was no romance, no passion, only necessity. And still, Henry's mind continued to spiral. His fears of being poisoned became an obsession. Servants were forced to taste every dish before he touched it, utensils were inspected with ceremonial precision. These rituals did not come from wisdom but delusion. The great mind that once reshaped England's religious destiny now shrank beneath the weight of imagined conspiracies. Each night brought with it the specter of death. His sleep was interrupted by violent nightmares and hallucinations. Witnesses described the king mumbling to the shadows, calling out to women long dead. Jane Seymour, who had given him the son he so desperately wanted, was mentioned most often, but some swore they heard the name Anne Boleyn, the queen he beheaded, the ghost he could never truly silence. During one particularly brutal episode of fever, a court physician recorded the king screaming into the night, "She walks. Her eyes are wide. Why does she not look away?" No one answered. No one dared. Yet, despite his collapsing body and tormented mind, no one in his court acknowledged the reality of his condition. To declare the king near death was, under English law, treason. Doctors who visited him were trapped in a grotesque theater of denial. They dressed his wounds and described his blackened flesh as healing. They reported his groans as signs of vitality. Meanwhile, the stench grew unbearable, seeping through walls and corridors. Perfumed gloves became mandatory for those serving near him. Still, they bowed, smiled, and praised their sovereign, even as decomposition set in. While he still drew breath, death, it seemed, was not permitted in the presence of the divine. His Majesty is no longer himself. He decays in body, and I fear, in soul. Yet we cannot speak it. To name his condition is to sign one's own warrant. We live in silence, surrounded by death. Music. The winter of the king's final year was a season cloaked in suffocating silence and barely concealed dread. By then, Henry was more phantom than monarch, confined to his chambers and barely coherent for long stretches. His breathing was labored, his skin ashen and blotched with signs of internal infection. The numerous untreated ulcers and festering wounds had likely given rise to septicemia, and each fever that came left him weaker, sweat-drenched, and closer to the brink. According to surviving documents, his attendants began to keep vigil, not out of reverence but out of necessity. His condition could shift dangerously within the hour, and no one wanted to be blamed for his unattended suffering. Despite everything, the unrelenting decay, the fevers, the grotesque swelling of his limbs, none were permitted to speak the truth aloud. The King of England was dying. Among the few still granted close proximity was Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, whose loyalty had withstood the storms of political betrayal and religious reform. But even he found himself summoned less for matters of state and more to ease the mind of a man who seemed increasingly haunted by his own past. In the dark hours of the night, Henry would sometimes weep uncontrollably, naming the dead in broken murmurs: Jane Seymour, whose death had left him inconsolable, Thomas More, the trusted friend he condemned to death, and even Thomas Cromwell, once his chief architect of reform and later discarded like so many others. "He carries the weight of 100 deaths on his soul," wrote a court attendant anonymously, "and in the stillness of night, they all rise to meet him." British Library, MS 89089. But no act of confession could cleanse his torment. He refused last rites until his final hours, believing recovery was still possible, perhaps out of pride, or perhaps because, even now, he feared the judgment that awaited him on the other side. The royal physicians, terrified of being accused of treason, maintained the facade. To acknowledge the king's decline was to risk the scaffold. Instead, they charted his humors, administered ineffective tinctures, and reported signs of improvement that existed only in their trembling voices. This denial extended to the entire court, where officials spoke in hopeful tones while avoiding the chamber that stank of human rot. Courtiers coated their faces with perfume, pressed scented cloths to their mouths, and navigated the royal apartments as if treading through a tomb. All the while, Henry's mental state flickered between lucidity and terrifying confusion. There were days when he barked orders, speaking as if he still held the reins of power. Then came moments of total silence, where he stared blankly into space for hours, unblinking, as if already gone. By January, his leg had turned black with gangrene. The swelling made even the touch of cloth unbearable, and servants often had to cut away the bed linens that fused with his flesh. The smell became unbearable. Reports from the time claimed that the odor of putrefaction reached 3 rooms away. The king's body, trapped in its immense, immobile prison, had become a vessel of agony. He could no longer stand, could not roll over, could hardly speak above a whisper. And yet, no announcement of his condition was made, no preparations were declared. English law, in its cruelty, criminalized even the suggestion of the sovereign's mortality. So the farce continued, the living corpse remained the head of the realm. Cranmer was finally summoned to his bedside in the early hours of January 28. The king had lost the ability to speak, but when the archbishop asked whether he died in the faith of Christ, the monarch's final gesture was a faint squeeze of the hand. That was all. The man who had reshaped the destiny of England, who had severed ties with Rome, claimed divine right to rule, and sent lovers and allies alike to their deaths, expired without words. He left behind silence, the foul stench of decay, and a kingdom uncertain of its future. Henry was 55 years old. His name was etched into history, not into stone. The service itself followed the expected rituals, solemn masses, the tolling of bells, Latin chants that echoed against cold stone walls. Yet, beneath the choir's voices, one could feel the discomfort of the priests and courtiers who had known too well the man now laid to rest. It was not a farewell charged with grief but with the burden of memory. The sermons spoke of divine kingship and the legacy of a ruler who had stood alone against Rome. They recounted his vision, his strength, his unmatched authority. But outside the chapel, the world whispered different truths. The nobility knew of the purges, the executions, the capricious cruelty that had colored the final years of his rule. Even among his closest allies, there was little mourning. Most had simply survived him, waiting for a breath of political air that was not choked with suspicion and fear. "It is over," wrote a lady of the court in a private letter. "Now we might sleep without fearing the morning trumpet." And sleep they did. The death of Henry VIII brought not just the end of a king but a moment of collective exhale across a nation that had held its breath for far too long. Outside the aristocracy, among the common folk, the reaction was even more ambiguous. For decades, they had known their king not through proximity but through policies that shaped their lives with relentless force. They saw monasteries shuttered, lands seized, taxes increased, and traditions uprooted. Many praised his break with the Pope, others condemned it. But nearly all could agree he had ruled with absolute power, and that power had taken a toll on everyone. Rumors spread through villages like wildfire. Some claimed his body had exploded before burial, others whispered that wolves had howled on the night he died. In a world still steeped in symbolism and superstition, his grotesque demise was more than a death, it was a sign. "He died as a beast dies," one anonymous pamphlet declared, "and no heaven shall receive him." Whether these were the voices of grief or vengeance, no one could deny that his death struck a deep chord. And then came the irony, the crushing, unspoken irony that would linger long after the incense had cleared. All his life, Henry had waged a war against nature in pursuit of legacy. He destroyed marriages, alliances, and lives in the desperate hunt for a male heir. Yet his son, Edward VI, a frail child born of immense cost, would rule for just 6 years before succumbing to illness. It was his daughters, born of the very wives he betrayed and executed, who would shape the future of England. Mary, fierce and devoted to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, would reverse his Protestant reforms in a violent campaign of Catholic restoration. And Elizabeth, daughter of the condemned and Boleyn, would become one of the most revered monarchs in English history. The man who changed a nation's soul to secure his bloodline had failed. His vision died with him. His daughters, the very lives he had nearly erased, would rise from the ashes of his empire. The great Henry is dead, the court mourned with its lips but not its heart. His crown lies heavy with the sins of his making. May God have mercy on us all. In the days that followed the funeral, the kingdom of England stood suspended in a strange, disquieting stillness. The weight of Henry's absence was not one of mourning but of consequence. His death left behind a political landscape scorched and fragmented by decades of authoritarian rule. Many of the great houses had been weakened, their heirs executed, disgraced, or too cautious to act. Parliament had long grown accustomed to silence, their voices buried beneath royal decree. Now, the power vacuum echoed like an empty crypt. No one knew if the machinery of government could move without the will of the king to drive it, or if the machine itself had long rusted into tyranny. The transition of power was not a celebration of legacy but a fragile balancing act atop the ashes of his decisions. At the heart of this uncertain realm stood young Edward VI, the king's only legitimate son, crowned in name but ruled by regents and ministers who saw in his fragile body both promise and vulnerability. The boy was intelligent and devout but also sickly, with a constitution unsuited for the demands of the throne. His reign would become a quiet contest of wills among ambitious men, each claiming to protect the realm while truly safeguarding their own interests. Yet, even among the circle of Edward's protectors, Henry's ghost loomed large. His reforms, religious, economic, and dynastic, had reshaped the structure of English life, but they were built on unstable foundations. The destruction of the monasteries had redirected vast wealth but also left voids in local charity and education. His break with Rome had created a new church, but it remained spiritually divided and politically volatile. Edward inherited not a crown but a crucible. Beyond court walls, the people of England bore the deeper wounds of Henry's rule. Entire communities had watched their abbeys burn, their monks vanish, their lands seized by men who once pledged piety. The sudden transformation from Catholic tradition to Protestant reform had not been gradual, it had been brutal. Latin masses were replaced, relics destroyed, saints defaced. For the common folk, who understood little of theology and even less of power, the change was terrifying. Many clung to the old rites in secret, whispering prayers in hidden chapels or under cover of night. Others embraced the new faith, not out of conviction but out of fear of reprisal. Henry's authority had been enforced by fire and blade, and the silence he left behind was a silence born not of peace but of exhaustion. As one chronicler noted, the land does not rejoice at its freedom, it wonders if it is truly free at all. In his final years, Henry had dismissed any notion of preparing his children jointly for succession. His will, revised shortly before death, set Edward as sole heir but named Mary and Elizabeth as successors only if Edward died without issue. He had called them both illegitimate at different times, annulled their mothers' marriages, and refused to allow them real power or presence in his council. Yet these same daughters, shaped by neglect and royal trauma, would rise from the margins of his rule to redefine English history. Mary, raised in isolation and humiliation, emerged hardened in her faith, determined to undo what she believed were her father's heresies. Elizabeth, highly educated but born under the shadow of her mother's execution, learned to survive in silence, mastering the art of observation and restraint. Neither had been trained for the throne, and yet both would wear the crown with a vision their father never achieved. The nobility watched this unfolding with weary eyes. Henry's court had been a landscape of executions and shifting alliances, and few had survived unscathed. Those who had once thrived under his favor now faced a future led by a boy too young to rule and two women shaped by his violence. The Tudor dynasty, once seen as invincible, now appeared fractured, its survival tied to children born of discarded queens. The hypocrisy was not lost on those who remembered the same king who had killed Anne Boleyn for alleged adultery, who accused Catherine Howard of treason, who annulled Anne of Cleves for lacking beauty, now rested beneath the earth while their children carried his name forward. He sought to craft his legacy in blood, wrote Bishop Gardiner, but the blood has turned against him. In foreign courts, ambassadors received news of Henry's death with mixtures of guarded celebration and diplomatic restraint. France and the Holy Roman Empire had long despised his defiance of Rome, his annexation of church lands, and his self-appointment as head of the English Church. His death was, in part, a vindication of divine justice to them. Reports sent to Emperor Charles V spoke of a king undone by his own appetites, consumed by illness and fear, and buried without honor. Others believed it was merely the natural culmination of excess. As Bishop Latimer later preached, "The Lord suffereth long, but even kings are dust, and to dust they must stink like any other man." That decay became a metaphor for the rot many believed had fed within the court for decades. For the court, however, survival depended on selective memory. Within weeks of Henry's death, a flurry of propaganda emerged to restore his dignity in the public eye. Chronicles emphasized his strength, his victories, his wisdom in matters of governance. Statues were commissioned, coins struck in his image, and ballads composed that spoke of justice and divine kingship. The grotesque details of his decline were omitted entirely, erased from official record, banished from the lips of chroniclers who valued their own heads. But the truth, whispered in letters and remembered by terrified attendants, endured in silence. The royal corpse may have been buried, but the stories of its leakage, its stench, and the dogs at Sion Abbey traveled farther than any edict. His body was sealed in lead and stone, but his fall from grandeur could not be entombed. What haunted England long after his death was not merely the political legacy he left but the human wreckage. Countless families bore scars from his wrath: widows, orphans, ruined houses, vanished monks, displaced peasants, all part of a kingdom restructured to reflect the desires of one man. And now that man was gone, not martyred, not revered, but removed by nature, not by justice. In taverns and in hushed corners of churches, some dared to speak of it plainly: the king had died like a beast, bloated and howling, feared to his final breath and unloved in the end. A monarch who had destroyed so many for the sake of legacy had left a corpse so horrifying that even the holy feared to touch it. As one chronicler phrased it bitterly, his crown endured, but his body betrayed him, the Anglican Chronicle, 1550. The irony was impossible to ignore. And yet, for all the horror, his legacy endured. The Anglican Church stood firm, its foundation laid by royal command rather than divine vision. The English monarchy, once entwined with papal authority, now stood alone, independent, defiant, and dangerously powerful. His policies ensured that future monarchs would wield influence with a reach he had made possible. But they also learned from his descent. Elizabeth, his daughter, would rule with a shrewdness and discipline that her father never possessed. She would study his errors, mirror his strength, and reject his excess. From the depths of his collapse, she would craft a new image of English rule, not based on brute force or divine right, but on calculated power and symbolic control. It was she, not Edward, who would secure the Tudor legacy, ironically, the daughter of the woman he executed. It is one of the great paradoxes of history that a man who began with so much promise, beauty, ability, ended as a grotesque caricature of himself, tormented by physical pain and mental instability, feared and flattered by those around him but rarely truly loved.